So I've just hit the record button. I want to make sure it's working. I don't see the icon. Oh, I think it's there. Okay, folks, welcome everybody. Just a few little housekeeping rules as normal. It's going to be a small group, so we do appreciate you if you can mute your mic. Myself and Bill will probably be the annoying two that will interrupt you or ask you questions throughout it, Jim, to make it more, I guess, interactive. And there's going to be a lot of session time at the end for folks to join in. But remember the chat box. Chat box is really important. And what we'll try to do is if there's an acronym or if there's something that you're not familiar with or a link to something that's within the ecosystem, we'll try to post it into the chat box for you. Okay. And so let me just go through this. My computer is not being cooperative here. Okay, there we go. Thank you. Okay, this is our weekly session. It's not a compulsory session, but we do encourage it to everybody to join. If you can't join, you can always listen to the YouTube playlist of every session. This is Group I, which means we have a good list of speakers that we're very pleased to have in the recording. And we've had all the quote unquote fathers of the internet in our speaker list over the years. And we're always looking for additional speakers, doesn't matter who they are. Please let us know if you have any suggestions. So today we're going to try to do as interactive as possible, but in addition, save up your questions and we can ask them at the last part. And most important is do not forget to do the survey. And I know some people are trying to evaluate everybody before they even come in. So that's not the way to do it. So when you go through the survey, select the name of the person who spoke today. That's the only person you're evaluating. That's important. And then the speaker can get some feedback. Okay, I just want to point out who's coming next week. I assume, Jim, you know Grace, former ICANN person. Oh, you're muted, Jim.
I am sure glad I'm not following Grace because she is fantastic.
Really difficult to get Grace because she works for the bureaucracy, NTIA. And when you find out next week how much money and dedication President Biden has done for Internet for All, it's mind-blowing. This is just unbelievable. It's one thing creating a technology. It's another thing going into community and doing substantive change and empowering people with the technology. And we're looking forward to Grace's presentation. We were very fortunate, I would say graced with her presence in a panel in Washington. So if those are interested in her assistant, Lynn Chin is the backup, she said, just in case she can't make it. Okay, so I have the honor to welcome Jim to the session, and his session is the evolution of the ICANN policymaking process via the new GTLD program. That's a real mouthful, and I've posted into the list the ICANN acronyms, the glossary, and without much ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jim so he can give a little bit more eloquent background bio on himself. So over to you.
Great, thanks, Glenn. And I will be mindful of the acronyms, and every time I use one without explaining it, I'll put $1 in the jar for you. So thanks, Glenn and Alfredo, for inviting me, and congrats to all those who are watching this online and catching the recording and participating in the VSIG. I think it's when I first joined the ICANN community 15 years ago, in fact, 15 years ago this month, there were no opportunities like the virtual school for internet governance. You sort of had to figure it out on your own. So I spent the first few years in the community wandering around aimlessly trying to figure stuff out. So kudos to Glenn and Alfredo and everybody else who's involved in these development projects and educational projects to make the transition into the community much easier. I think it goes a long way in getting people up and running a lot more quickly. I'm also the guy who several years ago, when I was putting together a panel at the Internet Governance Forum, or the IGF, I told one of my clients, Microsoft, I said, you can't use a PowerPoint. And the reason being is I wanted people to engage in an interactive discussion as opposed to focus on what's on the screen. And I'm still like that. So I know, Glenn, you mentioned hold questions to the end. I may beg your forgiveness and deviate from that a little bit if people do have questions. What I would propose is every couple of slides that we pause and we just, open it up and see if people have questions or discussion, or if you think things need to be further explained. I've only got like 6 or 8 slides, so it's not going to take anywhere close to 40 minutes. So a little bit about me. I actually, as I said, I got into this community about 15 years ago this month. I came from a political, public affairs, and lobbying background. I was a partner at a public affairs firm here in Washington, D.C., and woke up one day and realized that's not what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. Fast forward about 6 months, I launched my own consulting firm, the Galway Strategy Group, with a handful of clients, focused mostly in the ICANN space. It was one of these things where I was initially approached 2 years prior to going out on my own to come in on something, and due to a client conflict, we weren't able to take it. But I started following ICANN then and noticed what was going on, and always was interested in it. I ran the tech client portfolio at my old firm, so I had a working knowledge of a lot of the issues that we're talking about. But ICANN was, I had to Google what it was and figure out what it actually meant. I've got a degree in policy analysis from Cornell University in upstate New York. So I'm one of those few people who actually do what I studied in university. Now, it's evolved over the last 30 years or so, but it's a good skill to have when you're trying to wade through a lot of the issues that we deal with. My clients include registries, registrars, and even companies outside of the direct ICANN space that are interested in ICANN or interested in broader internet governance issues. I've worked on, it's well over 100 successful new GTLD applications. So new GTLD meaning new generic top-level domains. If you were to rewind the clock, and we can get into this in a little while, there's really a handful of top-level domains. The ones you're familiar with: com, net, org, name, jobs. And what we'll talk about is the expansion of that process. I also do a lot of work at the Internet Governance Forum, which is a large UN-sponsored event that kicks off this weekend in Kyoto, Japan, where a lot of the issues that on the internet governance level, including ICANN, but much further beyond ICANN, are discussed and debated. That conference is actually up to about 6,000 registrations as of last week. A lot of local participation we're expected on the ground, but obviously it's a hybrid event, so online participation from around the globe as well. And the last bullet point is nobody's ever hired me to make PowerPoints, so this is a pretty basic one as they come. So I beg your forgiveness on the style here. So if we can go to the next slide. So what I thought is, what I wanted to do is, the title of it is moving, the evolution of the ICANN policymaking process from the 2012 round to current. And why did I choose that? One, it's because I've been heavily involved in both, and I'll probably need counseling as a result of this down the line. But people talk about ICANN, in terms of it's a static organization, it's not evolving, things take too long, it's inefficient, et cetera. But I want to challenge that narrative, because through my intense involvement in the new GTLD program, I have seen changes, I have seen improvements. It's not something that's going to make headlines. It's not something that's going to change many people's opinion of ICANN, but I do think it's a story that needs to be told that not a lot of people are focused on. So, as I mentioned, 15 years ago, I got into this. In fact, it was a meeting with a client. VeriSign's a client. I think pretty much everybody in the community knows I work with them, and they are the operator of .net and .com. They got hired me, and they're like, "Can you be in Cairo next Friday for an ICANN meeting?" Literally, it was a week out. And I said, "Okay, yeah, I'll figure out a way." I figured that was my first test. And I remember going to my first ICANN meeting, and I was told look, here's the schedule. Unless the meeting is deemed closed, feel free to walk in, sit down, listen, contribute, etc. And it was so bizarre to me coming from the DC world, the Washington DC world, where you don't do that. It's very structured and rigid. The whole notion that I could just walk into any meeting was fascinating, but it was also unnerving at the same time, because I quickly found out how little I did know and how steep the hill that I had to climb was in front of me. So a little bit of the history of the NUCCI-TLD program is in June of 2008, at a meeting in Paris just prior to me getting involved, the ICANN board approved a recommendation to move ahead with expanding the NUCCI-TLD space. That was the linchpin and the capstone on a lot of community work that had been done in the years leading up to that. And looking forward a few months later to the ICANN meeting in Cairo, there was the first version of the applicant guidebook, sort of the Bible for people who were interested in applying for and operating their own new top-level domain. You'll see there's a big gap between 2008 and 2011. I'll talk to that in a minute. But in June 2011, the ICANN board finally approved the applicant guidebook, which really was a big milestone, which then eventually led to the program getting kicked off in January of 2012. The application window opened in January, closed at the end of March, and then ICANN held an event in June of that year in London where they called it Reveal Day, announced who had applied for what top-level domains. There was 1,930 applications, far more than anyone anticipated. For those who were involved in the applicant guidebook, the number that ICANN was planning for was 500. So when you're dealing with the number 500 for 3 years, and suddenly 1,930 applications show up, it's a little surprising. I think everybody was surprised by it. There were some things about it that people did not anticipate. Obviously, the sheer volume, interest from brands, corporates that wanted to apply for domains that matched either key products or the names of their company. And another thing I think that surprised a lot of people was this notion of what's called a portfolio applicant, where you had organizations that applied for 10, 20, 100. One group, then known as Donuts, applied for over 300 top-level domains at $185,000 in application. So that's a significant investment, significant bet on the future of the program. I have down here April 2013, which is I think a seminal moment within the ICANN history, and that is when the Government Advisory Committee issued their Beijing communique. It's called the Beijing communique, named after the location of the ICANN meeting. I'll get into this in a little bit, but it was a thorough examination of the program in retrospect. And it sort of pumped the brakes on a lot of things that could happen and sort of threw things in disarray. Glenn, we can go to the next stop.
Sure can.
Slide.
All right. Here we go.
There we go. So first question is, why did it take so long? And we can say, what took so long? So I think the first part is we had a period from October of 2008 to June of 2011, where all the focus was on this applicant guidebook. Turns out there were 10 versions over the period of time of that document. Started out at a very manageable 35 pages and rapidly grew to well over 100 pages. Why did it do that? Well, a couple of reasons. One, the way that the program was structured was different from previous expansion rounds, where when you had the additions of Biz and Info and some others, you applied for it and it was a beauty contest, so to speak. Your application was reviewed on the merits of your proposal. Not everyone was accepted. There wasn't a baseline of criteria that if you satisfied all these technical requirements, then you were granted the opportunity by ICANN to run your TLD. They picked and choose who they wanted to run and which TLDs they wanted out there. This was different. This was, if you got the money and you've got the application and you've got the expertise, you apply, you sign the contract, and you're off and running as long as you pass all your evaluations. So the process was a lot different. The other thing is, when you get involved in the ICANN community and the Internet Governance Forum community, there's a lot of very, very smart people in this space. Very smart people who are looking at things not from one or two different angles, but from multiple angles at all the time. Especially those people who, invested significant sums of money and were applying to hopefully own and operate these TLDs. I think one of the things that we sort of got hung up with a little bit was these very smart people were trying to solve for every scenario. And that's why you saw the guidebook go from 35 pages to 100. Now, I'm not saying that was wrong, but it takes time. It's the implementation work, having never done it before. It just took a lot of time. And then I think one of the big challenges was, as I mentioned earlier, is the retrospective input from the Government Advisory Committee. After the policy had been approved by the ICANN board, they came in and offered their advice once they had seen who had applied for what. And I realized that offering advice on unnamed application is a challenge, and there's always going to be things that pop up that nobody anticipates. But the look back, I think, is what really slowed down the program, and is something that I think we may not have going forward. So next slide.
Jim,
Oh.
could I ask you clarification on that?
Yeah.
So you're saying GAC took notice. Did they notice things that were obviously missing, or they took exception to some things? Because I take it they were not part of the earlier process, so they were genuflecting on what was produced. What was the end result of them taking notice?
So the advice that they issued was extremely thorough.
Okay.
Actually, let me take one step back. The way the GAC operated back then is a lot different than the GAC that we know today. I talked about early on, somebody giving me a schedule to that meeting in Cairo, saying, unless it's closed, you can go into any meeting you want and sit down and observe and even contribute. Not so with the GAC. Most of the GAC meetings were closed. So there were a few plenaries that they opened up to the public, but for years, they met behind closed doors. So they were, they were doing their work and they were doing their own analyses, but they were doing it not in a vacuum, but they were doing it on their own, which meant that nobody in the community knew until we saw an output what the concerns were and what the debates were about, and how we might have been able to head some of this off if there was just more bilateral engagement between the GAC and the rest of the community, or the GAC and ICANN staff. The operating in their own silo is, I think, something that hurt them. But as you'll see as we get into it, they don't operate like that anymore. In fact, I think that's one of the positive changes that have come out of this whole program. Was there a watershed moment that they realized that wasn't working, or there was a leadership change in the GAC? Like, it seems to me that they were doing things, according to their approach, and then something changed. So it strikes me that there must have been some kind of shift somehow. I don't know if there's a seminal moment where that happened, but you're right. I think, as I mentioned, the GAC has been around well longer than I have. It's evolved over time, but it always did things because that's the way the GAC does things. I think the Beijing communique was one of the watershed moments, and contributed to, listen, we kind of dropped a big surprise on the community, with our communique and the detail and the specificity. They were very concerned with several different categories of applications for domains that they were concerned about. So anything to do with health, public safety, finance, they called them category 1 strings, or top level domains that they thought there may be public policy implications for somebody outside of a government entity owning and operating these and how they would be operated. Concerns about fraud, abuse, content, who's applying for it. Do we know who's actually really behind it? Or is it, there's some applications coming from the Middle East that nobody really knew who the owners were. So I think that was one of them. It was hindsight, and it wasn't until a few years later that the GAC started to open up and be more transparent with how they were going. I think they realized that, okay, we used to do it like this, but now working hand in hand with the community is probably the best way to go. And they've even gone so far as, the first step was to open up more of the GAC meetings and the deliberations and the plenums. They've gone so far now that you can sit in the room and watch real time how the GAC develops their communique for every single ICANN meeting.
Wow.
They've got text up on the screen. They have people talking freely. It's not the most exciting thing in an ICANN meeting, but if you're into the weeds, on a certain issue and it's on their radar, you're in there. And what I have found is that nearly every GAC member will talk to you. You may have to initiate the contact, but most of the GAC knows what they know, and they know what they don't know. Because we're dealing with a very specific subset of issues within the ICANN space. And I think some members of the GAC are open to education or open to ideas because this is not what they do every day. These GAC reps have very broad portfolios that, ICANN is just but a slice of. And we can't expect them to be experts on all of our issues. So it's really incumbent upon the community and ICANN org to step up and try and help them do their job as best they can.
One more question, and again, this may have nothing to do with this, but I think of GAC. Remember when they were going through the .amazon discussion? So yeah. was the .amazon discussion something that made the GAC stand up and notice?
The Amazon discussion is one of those things that got everybody to stand up and notice. It was one of those few ICANN issues that actually went mainstream media. So you were reading articles and mainstream publications about the .amazon, I don't want to say battle, but the debates and the exchanges around it. Look, the countries that represent the Amazon region felt very strongly about what they wanted. Part of me thinks that's not over. Every once in a while you hear reference to it in various different fora, but no, that was definitely a flashpoint in the relationship between the GAC, the board, and the community.
There's a question from the chat. I'm not sure if you can see this. It's from LM. Was the drafting of the guidebook an internal ICANN process, or was the input of stakeholders that was also taken into consideration?
Very good question. And that's what it was open to public comment periods. Every time a new version of the DAG, the Draft Applicant Guidebook, would come out, ICANN would do a webinar. They would take questions, and then there would be a comment period where people could do feedback and provide feedback to ICANN. Now, like every ICANN comment period, sometimes they'll take your feedback and sometimes they won't, but there were definitely changes that were made to the guidebook as a result of feedback from the community. So it was a good process. I think 10 cycles of it may have been a little too much, and that's what led to some of the length. But some of the issues we were dealing with were quite complex at the time, and some of the work that needed to be done before the applicant guidebook, the first version, was published, really was never done. So that's another thing that I think is a lesson learned that we're taking going forward.
One other thing that I point out is that especially for GAC members from democratic governments, if someone from at large goes to them at a meeting and says, you need to think about this, that tends to get their attention, because where people who are involved in GAC come from in their country's bureaucracy, they tend, in my observation, to not be in a position where they get lots of interaction with the general public. And so if somebody shows up and is talking to them personally, it gets their attention. And so I think that may be something that's an ongoing development in how open GAC is to outside input.
Yeah, I think, Bill, one of the things too, I think helped was that the GAC used to be almost a self-supporting organization. They had a secretariat provided by one of the member states. And there was a shift where that organization no longer provided the support, and it became a function of ICANN, the organization. And ICANN, to their credit, resourced it fairly appropriately to get it going, and has since done a very good job of resourcing it with a very competent team of staffers who really go out of their way to ensure that members of the GAC are well organized, well briefed, are presented with as much information as they possibly need to deliberate and make decisions on these issues. That's not something that was evident or available during this time period. So I think, and it's one of the struggles I think we're seeing now with the GAC is turnover. A lot of these government officials either, are promoted to different posts. They cycle out of their ministry, their portfolio changes. And we're sort of having to go through, educating a new crop of members of the GAC. I think, if I'm not mistaken, within the last 2 years or so, we've seen turnover within like 120 different countries, which is phenomenal when you think about it. You lose a lot of institutional history, but that we still have a lot with some key players within the GAC.
Yeah, that's one thing with the previous chair of GAC. We were looking at only a dedicated VSIG course only for GAC members. It didn't work out because of timelines, but it's still our intention to have only GAC members in one of the dedicated courses. And it could be in French, English, or Spanish. So we're going to get back at that. So it's as you said, there's such a turnover, and it takes, and I started in 2009 and you started before me. It took years to understand the nuances of and speak eloquently, and I can't speak. So it takes a while.
Well, yeah, and as I mentioned, when I got in, there was no such thing as the VSIG. There was no such thing as the North American or the Southern Schools of Internet Governance. Even ICANN didn't really have a lot of resources on their website. My son is actually applying for the Next Gen program, and he and I were on the ICANN Learn website last night.
Okay.
And I'll confess, that was the first time I was on there. There is a lot of information in there. There's a lot of great courses, and they're varying levels of complexity, everything from ICANN 101 all the way up to how to effectively lead a meeting. Just a lot of different resources that I think are underappreciated and certainly underutilized.
Yep.
So if you want to go to the next slide,
okay. I am pressing my button, and it's it must be a Monday morning. Okay, we got it.
There we go.
We got it.
All right, and it looks like somehow I got losing part of it. That's anyway. So we had the new GTLD program, all these top level domains launched, and there's a line in the final applicant guidebook that just is the bane of some people's existence, and it makes the rest of us chuckle. And it was, ICANN will endeavor to launch the next round of new GTLDs no longer than 1 year after the conclusion of this round. I'm paraphrasing, but basically, next round begins within a year of this round closing. That was 12 years ago. It's taking some time, and there's reasons for it, but there's a lot of things that are different that are happening here. What have I seen? I've seen from the get-go a much broader engagement from across the community, starting with the ICANN board. You know, I very rarely remember members of the ICANN board formally participating in some of the actions that we, you know, the webinars on the applicant guidebook or some of the other development processes that we were having. This go around, the ICANN board has its, within the ICANN board, there is a special dedicated caucus of interested members who focus solely on this issue. There's several other caucuses, but there is a sub-pro caucus. So that immediately brings attention and focus at the board level to what's happening on a day-to-day basis in this policy development process. We got lucky and sort of hurt at the same time. When we began the policymaking process several years ago, one of our co-chairs was Avri Doria. And Avri, along with Jeff Newman, I believe Cheryl Langdon Orr was a third chair, but she may have been brought in. One of the things that happened that was bad for us, but good for her, is that Avri got selected to join the ICANN board of directors. So after being involved in the policy development process, she gets onto the ICANN board and is sort of looked at immediately as an expert around subpro because she had been involved prior to her engagement on the board. And she is now one of the, well, until for the next few weeks, she is one of the co-chairs of the board caucus that's focused on this issue. And both she and Becky Burr have been doing an incredible job of attending meetings, explaining the thought process behind some of the actions that the ICANN board has taken in ways that you can't do or understand from the resolutions that are passed. It's really a good bilateral discussion, seeing the thought process behind the decisions that the board is making, having the board getting direct feedback from the community so that we're much more in sync now than we were in the first go around. It's sort of like ships passing in the night. Another key development is the GAC formed a small team who became steeped in these issues as well. Again, those who had a personal interest or a country interest, but Canada, Switzerland, the United States, a few other countries, all were very focused on these issues and sort of did the legwork for the rest of the GAC in the sense that every time the GAC met, they, along with the leads from the subpro PDP, would do a briefing and a status update. That was, I thought they did a very good job at targeting it at the correct level for the audience. It wasn't diving down into the minutia. It was focusing on what are the big 2 or 3 issues from the last 3 or 4 months that have been discussed. Where do we think it's going? Amazingly, what are the GAC's concerns about this? Unlike the Beijing communique where we had no idea what the GAC was concerned about, we're being told months, if not years in advance, hey, we're concerned about these issues. We're concerned about those issues. We may do advice. We may work to try and change it. But, we're telling you right now, we're not entirely comfortable. That was really a big shift in how the GAC had operated from the previous round. As I mentioned, broader participation, the ICANN community seemed like it was a lot smaller when I joined. I don't, meetings were much smaller. And now with the subpro PDP, we had over 100 people that were signed up as part of that effort. Now, anybody who participates in a large group setting knows that, not everybody who signs up does as much work as the person sitting next to him. So within that 100, we had, 20 or so diehards that were on every call that were, really rolling up the sleeves, trying to make things go forward. But the fact that we still had well over 100 people from across the community was a good sign because it meant people were interested in this. They were contributing. It wasn't just a, one set of perspectives that were always doing the work. It was a pretty broad group. Let me just see the other, it's missing off the slide, but thankfully I printed something off. The other thing that I think benefited from us, and I just touched on it, is the earlier engagement in the process. The ICANN board has been paying attention all along. There should, and there was no surprises for the ICANN board on what the community was up to when we were working on the policies for the next round. again, the same with the GAC, you know, hearing months, if not years in advance, that they've got concerns with private auctions or they've got concerns with closed generics. You know, help the community focus on those issues and realize, you know, because of the unique role that the GAC has within the ICANN ecosystem, where if they issue formal advice on a topic, that carries a lot of weight with the ICANN board, and the ICANN board is bound by the bylaws to treat that advice much different than advice coming from other parts of the community. People pay attention to the GAC because advice from the GAC could stop types or, you know, individual TLDs in their tracks, as we've seen in the past. So the early engagement, the active engagement was something that we did not have last go around. And I think it's really certainly helped build a better product, so to speak. See, Bill's got a comment. One factor in the delay has been IDNs taking far longer. So I'll just read it out. One factor in the delay in the next round has been that the IDNs are internationalized domain names using non-English scripts. Project has taken far longer than anticipated. Having been involved in that on the Latin script generation panel, which took 7 years, I can speak to why that was. Yeah, I mean, you know, Bill, there's a little frustration in the sense that, you know, IDNs have been a quote focus of this program since 2008. And we still really haven't solved it. And, you know, I'm not saying it's an easy fix. But, you know, IDNs were a priority in the 2012 round. In fact, IDNs were put to the front of the line to launch first before any Latin character TLDs. So I think there's frustrations as that IDN work that you've been involved in is beyond my skill set, but I sleep well at night knowing that others are doing the work. But I don't know if you want to come in on the microphone and maybe share a little more reflection or contribution on that.
I think sleeping well at night might not be the wisest course.
Okay.
A lot of the work that was done by people who were not trained linguists. I had because one of my majors half a century ago was anthropology, and I actually had a couple of linguistics courses, which I hadn't had any use for decades. But that helped me. But the other 6 people on the panel were just people from a couple of other European countries, so they were familiar with some of the diacritic marks that get used in European languages. But basically, we were making it up as we went along, and you know, it turns out there are some 20 different diacritic marks that get used in one or another of the Latin scripts. And the average person maybe has run into 7 or 8 of them, assuming they've encountered, you know, 6 or 8 languages. But the challenge, and I think we failed at the challenge, but the challenge was to say, okay, we know all these 20 diacritics, and so we've looked at them and we're pretty good at telling the difference. But the challenge was, how well would somebody who isn't familiar with all of these be at distinguishing a couple of diacritics that they've never seen before? We got some of that right, but we've got several that were wrong. And that isn't really too bad for the top level domains, because there are plans for the next round to have a similarity review panel to do a manual review on, you know, how distinguishable are these 2 proposed TLDs. But when that was applied unchanged to the recommendations for second level domain names, which obviously don't get manual review, I think ICANN has set itself up for some severe challenges there. And it's something I've raised both with the IDN project and, in fact, I went so far as to bring it up with the ICANN executives when they were incautious and held a public question session. But I think we're going to have something of a mess going forward, and I'm not quite sure how that can be corrected.
Hmm. Hmm.
The example I gave was there, out of the couple of hundred languages that use the Latin script, there are 5 or 6 which use something called I with acute, where the dot above the I is replaced by an acute accent. For top-level domains, so it's considered that those are distinguishable. But suppose somebody wants to register ICANN.org and they replace the I with an acute. That'll sail right through, which will be irritating for ICANN, but not really do any great damage.
Mm-hmm.
But if somebody does the same thing with, say, the Citibank CITI.com and replaces the I's, how many people will catch that and how many people will not? And there's a huge opportunity to do a little fishing and farming and get people to put in their IDs. And then if the bad actors go through, clean out all of the accounts that they've got access to, that'll be a problem. And I assume you know enough about American law to immediately be thinking class action lawsuit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
And
no,
the
the subject of IDNs is definitely it's a challenging one, and it, as you mentioned, it is one of the holdups or one of the gating factors for getting the next round launched. You know, the challenge is these issues are not new. You know, we should have been working on these a long time ago. The focus just wasn't there, even though the headline was, you know, IDNs are going to go first. Did they actually work when they launched them? That was a challenge. And would, you know, universal acceptance issues, which is a term that we use to talk about, can you use it as your email address, and would your airline accept it as a valid email address for you to book your airline tickets? The question I see in there from Jean or Jean is, what is the origin story of the term international domain names? The way it is typically presented implies that Latin script based domains are not international. That is a very good question to which I don't have an answer. I don't know. I'm sure, as Glenn talked about earlier, having sort of the grandfathers of the internet on there, I'm sure they were in the room when that happened. That was well before my time, but now you've planted a bug in my ear. I'm going to have to go look that up someplace.
I think Bill responded to that. Bill, did you want to elaborate?
Yeah, there are about some 400 plus languages that use the Latin script or some variation on it. We actually only looked at 200 of them. We looked at all the languages that are an official language somewhere. That is, you can do business with the government with them. And we also looked at any language which isn't an official script but has over 1 million native speakers. So that got us down to 200 languages.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them, other than English, use one or more diacritic marks on one or more letters. If you're familiar with Spanish, it's like the little wavy line over the N. If you're familiar with French, that includes the little squiggle under the C, etc. But as I mentioned earlier, any given language maybe uses 6 at the outside, with the definite exception of Vietnamese, which uses an amazing number. But nobody uses as many as 10 out of the 20 diacritics in the script that's used to write their language. So
Yeah, I think
we did look at a lot of languages that use the Latin script. It wasn't definitely wasn't ignored.
right, but I think the root of Jean's question is there are a lot of Latin script domains out there that are non-English. So why are they, why aren't they called international? I think zeroing in on why is anything that's non-Latin called international? I don't know. Seems like a marketing faux pas at the beginning.
I think I think the Latin scripts are, at least within ICANN, considered international as well. It's just that things like Chinese or Arabic are so much more obviously different that there tends to be a focus on those. But it's
sounds like Glenn has a potential another unit for the VSIG to bring in an expert speaker on IDNs in the future.
I think I will ask you guys when you're in Hamburg, because I won't be there. There is SARMET does get together the IDN committees, and we created with a group in Canada, and it's for the States too. We're looking at elevating the awareness of Indigenous languages script, and it's consistent with the Canadian government strategy to promote Indigenous languages, but it's not limited to just Canada. So any Indigenous language, which is largely ignored on the web. So if anybody's interested in that, please join the IDN groups. They're more than welcome to join it.
So I know we're coming up on time. I have two more quick slides, and they're not a lot of heavy. And if we got any more questions or discussion, I'd love to do it. Okay. So, as the last slide, what's different this go around? I guess the next logical question you have to ask is, what has this led to? A lot fewer surprises. Nobody likes surprises, especially when you're trying to get the program off the ground. So, as I mentioned, the early engagement from the GAC, the early engagement from the board, a much broader participation from the community means that those who are actually drafting language, drafting policies, are not getting these surprises after the pens are put down. Okay. We've had a much more thorough examination of the issues. Unlike the last round, we didn't have any like in the last round, we didn't have any track record to look back upon and see what worked and what didn't. This time we did. And for all the successes that people want to talk about with the new GTLD program, there are a lot of problems, and those problems can't persist into the next round. So we needed to figure out what they were and try and solve for them. And that obviously has led to a longer policymaking process than anybody had really hoped to at this point. It's taken a long time, but I think it's led to a much higher quality output. If you're ever suffering from insomnia, you can read the PDP final report. It's 135 pages, I think. Oh. And then you can read the board's resolutions on which recommendations they accept and which they reject. It's a much more detailed conversation where we know everybody's positions and what their concerns are, and then now we can actually focus and work on solving those in the next phase. So next slide, please. So there's a couple of lessons, and I think engagement early and often. Again, avoiding those surprises. The fact that the GAC has been active participants in various aspects of this program in the second round has helped. We know where they're coming from. They're contributing. ICANN board is signaling what they're comfortable with and what they're not comfortable with. And they're not just doing it once a year. It's on a regular basis. Anybody can contribute. I mean, that is going back to one of the first things I said about how they gave me the schedule in Cairo and I can walk into any door except for a closed meeting. Anyone can contribute to these policymaking processes that I can. Don't think you have to be in the community for 6 years and be deemed an expert. We're always looking for new ideas, new perspectives, and new inputs. It will only make the process better. You know, so for those who are not involved in the ICANN community yet, but are thinking about it, there are a lot more resources for you today than there were for Glenn and I 15, 14 years ago. Take advantage of them and just show up, just participate. You know, it doesn't, you know, that's the bottom line. Finding the Zoom room is probably the hardest thing standing between participating and not. But I think, you know, with the resources you have to come up to speed, there's certainly a need for more volunteers in the community. Both, you know, people aren't going to do this forever. People are burning out. And, you know, as the internet becomes more and more global, we need to have more and more perspectives from around the globe. And that means participation from places other than North America and Western Europe. So that's sort of what I wanted to share with everybody today. The next slide is the old question mark. I know we've already had a few questions in the chat, but Glenn, I don't know if you or anybody else has anything else that they want to ask me or anything I can help contribute.
Okay, folks, please go ahead and ask, fire away if you have any other questions. My question mark is not showing up for some unknown reason. Oh, there it is.
I went fancy. I animated my final slide, Glenn.
Ah, that you threw me off. I'm clicking away. Let me just take it off share screen. And Bill, did you want to go ahead and any comments or anyone else? David, Jean, anyone have any questions? I'm looking on the and if any of you are going to Hamburg, please make a point of reaching out to, or if any of you are going to be at the IGF, you're going to be there next week, right?
Yeah, by all means, if you ever see me in an ICANN meeting, just grab me and be happy to have a coffee and share what I can with you. It's not a lot, but maybe it'll help you in your journey.
No, nothing from Jean. Wow, that time went really quick. I just sent an email to the VP of North America, Nelia, on how this session complements what Joe was to do last week. And folks, we do apologize that Joe could not make it. Unfortunately, Joe was sick, but we're going to do a recording. So these will be nice bookends. And we wanted to have Joe's before, but we'll share that with you. So we have I think 120 recordings, and I did have Sarmed as one of our speakers. And so universal acceptance is something that Norello and other at-large groups have been really big on, and I know Bill is a big participant with that as well. But I'd like to thank you for your time. I just want one more last. Anything else, anyone, before I close up? No, that's it. Well, great. I do feel bad that I'm not able to see you. Maybe I'll see you in San Juan when the next ICANN meeting. But again, thank you again for your time. Thanks everybody for joining us. And the recording will be posted as soon as possible.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.